Hello and welcome back to the Abyssal Archive. Here on this channel we document real accounts from people who work in and around the deep ocean, recorded and read slowly, so you can relax and drift off while you listen. Most of what we cover here isn't dramatic in the way horror stories usually are. There are no chases, no jump scares, no monsters leaping out of the dark. What you'll hear instead is quieter than that, and in some ways harder to shake off once you have the testimony of sonar technicians, submersible pilots, saturation divers, and instrument engineers, people whose entire professional training is built around ruling out the strange explanation first, methodically, instrument by instrument, until sometimes, not often, but sometimes, there's nothing mundane left to rule it out with. Every account in tonight's collection comes from someone who works, or worked, in some part of the deep ocean industry, and every one of them still, to this day, keeps a personal copy of the data that convinced them something down there was watching back. If you're tuning in from somewhere with a coastline, let me know in the comments where. Now settle in, dim the lights, and let's begin. The first alarm came in at 3:14 in the morning, ship time, 40 minutes before I was supposed to hand off the watch. I worked as a sonar technician aboard a geophysical survey vessel called the Corvid Rise, contracted to run seabed mapping lines for an energy company off the Chukchi Shelf. My name was Nora Van Tassel. I was 31 then, 5 years into subsea survey work. Most of it spent staring at waterfall displays in a windowless room that smelled like coffee and machine oil. The Corvid Rise was 110 meters long, crewed by 22 people, and she carried a multi-beam array under the hull, along with 2 towed side-scan fish we streamed off the stern on faired cable. Night watches were quiet. You logged position, you watched for equipment faults. You drank bad coffee, and mostly nothing happened except the slow crawl of bathymetry filling in on the monitor, one swath at a time. That night the sea state was calm, 2-meter swell, wind out of the northwest at maybe 12 knots. We were running a survey line over a stretch of seabed nobody had mapped in detail before, about 4,000 meters of water beneath the keel, well past the edge of the continental shelf where the bottom drops fast. I had been watching the multi-beam return for 6 hours by then, the usual grey topography scrolling past, ridges and sediment drift and the occasional pockmark from gas seepage. At 3:14, the display threw a temperature anomaly alert on the CTD sensor we towed alongside the array. I want to be clear about what that means. CTD stands for conductivity, temperature, depth, and it's about as boring an instrument as exists on a research vessel. It logs water column properties continuously. It does not usually alarm. The reading showed a 2.6 degrees Celsius spike at 3,880 meters depth, isolated to a column maybe 40 meters wide, gone as fast as it appeared. My first thought was sensor fault, because that's what it almost always is. Salt, bridging on the conductivity cell, a bad ground, a loose connector vibrating in the tow cable. I logged it, flagged the sensor for inspection at the next recovery, and kept working. 20 minutes later it happened again, same magnitude, this time at 3,910 meters, about 70 meters further along our track. I pulled the raw voltage trace instead of the processed reading because a real sensor fault usually shows up as noise or a flat line, not a clean, well-shaped thermal spike that rises and falls over about 11 seconds. This one rose and fell over about 11 seconds. It looked like real data. I called up to the bridge and told the second mate on watch, a quiet man named Desmond Okafor, that I had an anomalous water column reading and wanted to know if we'd crossed anything on the nautical chart that might explain it. He said no known seeps, no charted vents, nothing in the survey brief about thermal activity in this block. I asked if he could see anything on the surface radar or visually. He said the sea was flat black, no vessel traffic for 80 miles, nothing on AIS. That matched what I expected. Deep ocean at 3 a.m. usually looks like nothing at all. At 3:52, the multibeam data started showing something in the water column itself, not on the seabed. Multibeam sonar is built to profile the bottom, but it also picks up anything solid enough to reflect an acoustic return between the hull and the seafloor. Fish schools mostly, sometimes gas bubble plumes, sometimes debris. What showed up was a single column of returns rising from roughly 3,900 meters toward the surface, moving at what the processing software calculated as approximately 4 meters per second. That's fast for anything biological at that depth. I checked the display twice because my instinct was still sensor artifact. Artifacts don't usually have a consistent vertical velocity logged across 60 consecutive pings. I woke the survey lead, a soft-spoken oceanographer named Priya Ilangavan, who'd been doing this work for almost 20 years and had seen, by her own account, every kind of instrument malfunction the ocean could produce. She came down in a robe over her thermals, looked at the trace, and did what I'd already done. Pulled the raw data, checked calibration logs, cross-referenced against the second CTD sensor, mounted separately on the frame. Both sensors showed the same anomaly at the same timestamps. That ruled out a single hardware fault, because two independently wired instruments do not fail identically and simultaneously by coincidence. Priya asked if we still had the water column return on multibeam. I checked. The rising column had stopped climbing at around 1,200 meters and now held steady there, no longer ascending, still registering as a solid mass, roughly the size of a school bus by cross-sectional estimate, though multibeam gives you shape poorly at range and depth. She frowned at that and said something I've thought about since. She said, "Whatever's giving us that return isn't behaving like it wants to be seen anymore." I asked what she meant. She said a rising thermal column with a moving acoustic target usually means something is transiting the water column, a whale, a large aggregation of deep scattering layer organisms disturbed by something below them, or gas escaping a seabed feature. But something that climbs fast, then stops and holds altitude precisely at 1,200 meters, isn't behaving like an animal responding to instinct. It's behaving like something maintaining a position. We altered course to keep the towed array clear of it, standard caution around any unidentified water column target, since a towed sensor package is expensive and cable strikes are the kind of thing that ends careers. As we came about, the acoustic target on multibeam began to move again, this time laterally, tracking almost exactly parallel to our new heading, staying roughly 800 meters off our port beam at the same depth. Priya had Desmond radio the bridge to hold, heading steady for 10 minutes as a test. If the target adjusted to match a deliberate course change, that told us something about whether it was tracking us or simply drifting on a current we hadn't accounted for. It matched the course change within 90 seconds. I want to describe what the control room felt like at that point, because I think it matters more than anything I can say about the data itself. Nobody said anything alarming. Nobody raised their voice. Priya just sat very still in front of the multibeam display, one hand resting flat on the console, and said, "Keep logging everything, timestamp everything, don't touch the array controls unless I tell you to." That kind of quiet is worse than panic. Panic means someone still believes there's a fast, obvious response available. Quiet like that means someone with 20 years of experience has run out of familiar explanations and is now simply trying not to lose the data. At 4:31, the target on multibeam dropped straight down from 1,200 meters to beyond our maximum detection range in under 4 seconds. The vertical rate implied by that transit, assuming the target didn't simply vanish, which sonar returns don't usually do without a hardware explanation, was faster than anything in the published literature on large deep-sea organisms, faster than a sperm whale's fastest recorded dive rate by a wide margin. Priya wrote, "Descent rate implausible for known biology. Recommend hardware review," in the log, which is the kind of sentence that looks calm on paper and means something else entirely when you were the one watching the screen. The CTD sensors stopped registering anomalies after that. We finished the survey line without further incident, though I noticed Desmond kept the bridge radar on a tighter sweep than usual for the rest of his watch, and nobody joked about it over breakfast the way the crew usually joked about equipment glitches. Priya requisitioned the raw acoustic logs for the company's data science team when we made port in Dutch Harbor 11 days later. I asked her before we docked what she thought it actually was. She said the honest answer was she didn't know, and that not knowing was the entire point of doing this job in 3,000 plus meters of water most people never see. You learn quickly that unidentified is a permanent category down there, not a temporary one waiting to be solved. The data science team's report came back 6 weeks later. It confirmed the thermal anomaly was present in both independently calibrated sensor streams, ruled out equipment fault with reasonable confidence, and classified the acoustic water column target as biological or unknown, insufficient resolution for further characterization. That was the entire conclusion. No follow-up survey was funded for that block. The energy company's interest was in seabed geology for pipeline routing, not water column biology. And once the survey lines were complete, nobody had a budget reason to go back and look harder. I still have the raw acoustic file on a personal drive. Sometimes I open the water column plot and watch the target climb, hold at 1,200 meters, drift to match our heading, then vanish downward faster than anything alive should be able to move in that pressure and that cold. I've shown it to 2 other sonar techs since, on other ships, without telling them the story first. Both of them, independently, looked at the descent rate and said the same word before I told them anything. That's wrong. Neither of them could tell me what would produce a wrong reading like that. Neither could I. The Corvid Rise finished her charter that season and was reassigned to a different operator the following year. I never went back to that block of ocean, and as far as I know, nobody else has surveyed it since. I was 300 meters down inside a saturation diving bell when the topside comms started acting strange. I worked as a bell diver for a commercial diving contractor, doing subsea inspection and light construction work, mostly pipeline tie-ins and platform maintenance in the Gulf of Mexico. My name was Rourke Ellender. I'd been in saturation diving for 11 years by then, which in that trade makes you old. Most divers don't last that long in the chambers before the pressure work or the isolation gets to them, one way or another. I was good at my job because I didn't let my mind wander during a dive, and that night was the first time in 11 years that discipline failed me. Saturation diving works like this, for anyone who hasn't spent time around it. You live in a pressurized chamber system on the surface support vessel for weeks at a time, breathing a helium-oxygen mix, your body's tissues fully saturated with inert gas at working pressure so you can be transferred down to the job site in a diving bell without decompressing every trip. That night we were working a subsea manifold inspection at 340 meters. My dive partner Callum Reyes and I locked out of the bell on umbilicals. doing a visual and NDT inspection on flange bolting that the client wanted documented before a tie-in the following week. Routine work. Cold, dark, slow, methodical. The kind of job you do 100 times in a career without anything unusual happening. The water at that depth is black, in a way that surface divers never experience. Our bell lights threw maybe 15 meters of visibility in clean water, less if there was any suspended sediment. Sound underwater at that pressure carries strangely too. Your own breathing through the mix is loud, mechanical, rhythmic, and everything else outside that sounds flattened and distant, like it's arriving through a wall. Topside comms crackled in my ear the whole dive. Standard chatter, life support checks, depth confirmations, the surface supervisor Dana Whitlock running the standard checklist every 15 minutes. About 40 minutes into the work, Callum's voice came through comms sounding off. Not panicked, just off. The way someone sounds when they're concentrating hard on something that doesn't add up. He asked if I had eyes on the far side of the manifold. I told him no, I was working the near flange. He said there was something reflecting his headlamp back at him from past the structure, low, near the seabed, and it wasn't moving. Manifolds down there don't have a lot of reflective surface. Everything's matte-coated to resist corrosion, so a reflection meant either polished metal debris or something wet and smooth. I told him to log it and stay on task, since going off-plan on a saturation dive without surface authorization is how divers get hurt, or worse. Dana came over comms and asked Callum to describe it in more detail for the log, which is standard procedure. Anything unusual on the seabed near client infrastructure gets documented for the inspection report. Callum said it looked like a flattened, elongated shape, maybe 4 meters long, lying against the sediment about 12 meters past the manifold's northeast corner, outside his working light, but catching the edge of it. He said it hadn't moved the entire time he'd been looking at it, which he estimated at almost 2 minutes by then. I finished my bolt torque check and moved around the structure to get a look myself. What I saw, in the narrow cone of my headlamp, was a pale, smooth-edged shape resting on the seabed, exactly where Callum said. It did not look like debris. Debris at that depth is usually crusted with sediment or marine growth within months of settling, and this had no growth on it at all, which either meant it was recent or meant something about its surface didn't allow growth to attach. I want to be precise here because precision was the whole job. I estimated the shape at 4 to 5 meters in length, maybe a meter across at its widest point, tapering at both ends, resting flush against the bottom, with no visible articulation or texture. My instrument light caught what might have been a faint sheen along its upper surface, consistent with wet skin rather than metal, though at that range and in that visibility I could not be certain, and I logged it as such. Possible biological mass, unconfirmed, no movement observed. Dana asked if we should approach for a closer inspection or photograph it for the report. I said I wanted to finish the scheduled bolt inspection first, both because that was the paying job and because approaching an unidentified object on the seabed at 340 meters without a clear read on what it was ran against every piece of training I'd had. Callum agreed. We went back to the flange work, staying oriented so that one of us always had a sight line on the shape, which is its own kind of discipline, working a precision inspection task while keeping half your attention fixed on something you can't explain, sitting 15 meters away in the dark. About 6 minutes later, Callum said it had moved. Not dramatically. He described it as having rotated maybe 30 degrees, so that what had been its long axis pointed more toward us than before. I looked over and confirmed the same thing. There was no current strong enough at that depth in that location to reposition something that size. We'd checked the tidal current tables before the dive and logged near zero bottom current for the dive window. Dana asked if we wanted to abort and return to the Belle. Both Callum and I said no, not yet, because aborting a saturation dive early costs the client tens of thousands of dollars in decompression scheduling, and because neither of us wanted to be the diver who called off a job over what might turn out to be an oddly shaped sediment mound. I finished the last 2 bolts. As I did, my umbilical pressure gauge, the one that monitors gas supply pressure from the Belle, showed a brief drop of about 4 psi, recovering within seconds. That's the kind of fluctuation that happens sometimes with umbilical kinking or minor supply system variance, and under normal circumstances I would have noted it and moved on without a second thought. Dana flagged it from topside independently before I'd said anything about it, which meant it wasn't something localized to my perception down there. The surface monitoring system had caught the same anomaly on its own gauges. She asked if either of us had snagged our umbilical on the structure. Neither of us had. Our umbilicals were both clear, hanging free behind us the way they should. Callum's voice came through comms again, quieter this time, and he said the shape had moved closer. I turned my headlamp toward it and saw that it had, in fact, closed roughly half the distance between where it had originally rested and our position at the manifold, without either of us having seen it traverse that ground. It was simply nearer than it had been a minute before. I want to be honest that this is the point where the training stopped fully working for me. 11 years of saturation diving teaches you to move deliberately no matter what your instincts are telling you, because panic at depth kills divers faster than almost anything else, and I held to that. But I also, without discussing it with Callum first, began backing toward the Belle's lockout trunk, coiling slack umbilical as I went, the way you do at the end of a dive. Dana's voice stayed level the entire time, running us through a controlled return to the Belle rather than an emergency ascent, because an uncontrolled bolt for the surface from saturation depth is a death sentence regardless of what's chasing you. She talked us back step by step. Callum reached the trunk first. As I followed, my headlamp swept back across the shape one final time, and in that pass I registered, I want to underline that this was maybe half a second of visual information at the edge of a 15-meter light cone in near total blackness. What looked like a long, pale surface unfolds slightly along one edge, the way a wet sheet lifts at one corner in a draft. Then I was inside the trunk, and Callum was sealing the hatch behind us, and the Belle was rising the short distance back toward its cradle on the support vessel. All according to procedure, nothing rushed, nothing outside protocol. We finished the saturation shift on schedule 4 days later, decompressing on the standard tables with no medical complications for either of us. The inspection report noted an unidentified biological mass observed near the manifold's northeast quadrant. No further characterization possible. Recommend follow-up survey with ROV. To my knowledge, no follow-up survey was ever conducted. The client's priority was the tie-in work, not marine biology, and the tie-in proceeded on schedule the following week with a different dive team who reported nothing unusual. Callum left saturation diving about a year later for topside supervisory work, and though we've stayed in touch, neither of us has ever fully agreed on how large the shape actually was, or how far it had actually closed the distance, because in that kind of blackness, at that kind of pressure, your instruments are the only honest witness you have, and the instruments only told us about a 4 CI pressure fluctuation that resolved itself in under 10 seconds and was never explained. The ROV lost telemetry for the first time at 2,600 meters, on a dive that was supposed to be routine cable inspection work. I piloted remotely operated vehicles for a subsea cable maintenance company, and at the time of this account, I was working aboard a cable ship called the Meridian Concord, tasked with inspecting a stretch of transatlantic fiber optic cable that had shown intermittent signal degradation. My name is Callan Reyes, no relation to the diver in the previous account, a coincidence of a common surname that I only mention because someone will ask. I'd been flying ROVs professionally for 9 years, most of that on cable work, which is unglamorous, precise, and almost never eventful. You fly a slow track along the cable route, you look for chafe, exposure, biofouling, or mechanical damage, and you document what you find. That's the entire job description, and I liked it precisely because nothing ever happened. The Rove Y flew that trip was a work-class vehicle called Otter 9, rated to 4,000 meters, equipped with 2 manipulator arms, a suite of cameras, and a full sensor package including sonar, current profilers, and a magnetometer we used for locating buried cable sections. The vehicle was tethered to the ship through several kilometers of armored umbilical, which carried power and full bandwidth telemetry both ways, video, the sensor data, control signals, so that from the control van on deck, flying the ROV felt almost like being down there yourself, minus the cold and the pressure. We'd found the section of cable showing signal loss about 6 hours into the dive, a stretch running along a shallow depression in otherwise flat sediment, and I was flying a slow pass along it with the vehicle's floodlights on, documenting cable condition on video, while my co-pilot, a younger tech named Isabel Okonkwo Marsh, logged sensor readings and kept an eye on navigation. The cable itself looked intact along the section we could see. No obvious chafe, no exposed conductor, nothing visually explaining the signal degradation reported by the operations center on shore. At 2,614 meters depth, according to the vehicle's pressure sensor, the video feed pixelated for about 2 seconds and recovered. That happens sometimes with long tether systems, a momentary bandwidth hiccup, usually meaningless. I noted it in the log out of habit and kept flying. 90 seconds later it happened again, longer this time, closer to 5 seconds of degraded video, and when the feed recovered, the sonar display showed something it hadn't shown before, a return roughly 18 meters off our port side, low profile, close to the seabed, moving at a velocity the tracking software estimated at just under 2 meters per second, paralleling our course. Isabel flagged it before I said anything, which told me I wasn't imagining the pattern. Cable inspection work occasionally turns up marine life near the route. The cable itself sometimes acts as a kind of artificial reef feature over years, attracting fish, occasionally larger animals investigating an unfamiliar structure on an otherwise featureless plain. I slowed the ROV's forward speed and adjusted the floodlight angle to try to bring whatever it was into camera range, standard procedure for documenting an unexpected contact, since the operations center liked biological observations logged even when they weren't the primary objective. The sonar contact adjusted its position to stay just outside our floodlight cone. I want to be careful about how I describe that, because it's easy in hindsight to make a pattern out of coincidence. But over the next 4 minutes, I altered the ROV's heading 3 separate times, small course corrections of 10 to 15 degrees, testing whether the contact was simply moving on a fixed heading of its own that happened to parallel ours, or whether it was actively adjusting to remain at the edge of our light and camera range. Each time I altered heading, the contact's relative bearing to us stayed almost exactly constant within about 5 seconds. That is not how drifting debris behaves. That is not typically how disoriented fish behave either, in my experience, which by that point in my career was fairly extensive. The telemetry started degrading again this time in a pattern I hadn't seen before. Not a clean dropout, but a kind of rhythmic stutter, video and sensor data both cutting for roughly half a second at regular intervals of about 4 seconds. Isabel checked the tether integrity readout, which monitors the umbilical for physical damage or excessive strain, and it showed nominal, no fault indicated. I asked the surface support crew to check the topside end of the system, the winch and the slip ring assembly that transfers signal from the rotating cable drum to the fixed shipboard electronics. They found nothing wrong there either. Whatever was interrupting the signal was happening somewhere along several kilometers of tether in open water, and there was no physical explanation available from either end of the system. During one of the longer stutters, close to 8 seconds that time, the sonar display, which apparently had enough buffered data to keep updating briefly even with the main video and control link degraded, showed the contact closing distance rapidly from 18 meters to what the system calculated as under 6 meters, before the display froze entirely as full telemetry loss set in. For 11 seconds, according to the ship's log, we had no video, no control input capability, no sensor data, nothing but a dead cursor on a black screen and the low hum of the winch motor holding station on the tether. I have flown ROVs for 9 years, and I have never sat through 11 seconds that felt longer. When telemetry restored, the video feed showed the ROV's floodlights illuminating open water and sediment, nothing unusual in frame, nothing near the vehicle. But the manipulator arm on the ROV's port side, the hydraulic arm normally folded against the chassis in transit configuration, was extended and rotated roughly 40 degrees from its last commanded position, a position it should not have been able to reach without a deliberate control input, and no control input had been sent during the blackout, since the link had been fully down. Isabel checked the control log, which records every command sent to the vehicle, regardless of whether telemetry confirmation was received. It showed no arm movement commands issued during the outage window. The arm had moved on its own, or had been moved, and the system had no record of how. We aborted the dive at that point, brought Otter 9 back to the surface on a controlled ascent, and once the vehicle was recovered on deck, our maintenance technician did a full inspection before anyone touched it further. The port manipulator's hydraulic lines showed no leaks, no pressure anomalies, nothing mechanically explaining an unauthorized actuation. What she did find, on the outer housing of the arm's wrist joint, was a set of shallow, evenly spaced score marks in the titanium coating, 4 parallel lines about a centimeter apart, running across roughly 15 centimeters of surface. The maintenance tech said in 11 years of servicing that vehicle class, she had never seen marks like that from any known cause. Not chafe, not impact damage, not corrosion. Nothing in the maintenance manual's damage classification guide matched the pattern. We finished the cable survey the following week, using a different, less experienced pilot for the remaining dives at the operations manager's discretion, without incident. The signal degradation on the cable itself was eventually traced to a manufacturing defect in a repeater unit, roughly 40 kilometers further along the route, unrelated as far as anyone could determine to whatever we'd encountered. The cable company's incident report on the telemetry loss listed the cause as undetermined possible electromagnetic interference, which is the kind of phrase that closes a file without answering the question anyone actually wanted answered. I still have the photograph of those score marks on my phone. I've shown it to 2 other ROV pilots since. Both of them asked the same question, independently, before I'd told them anything about how the marks got there. What was down there with you? The hydrophone array picked up the first sound at 1:52 in the morning, and I almost dismissed it as a whale. I worked as a research technician at a seafloor observatory station off the coast of Oregon, part of a cabled network that monitored ocean conditions continuously from fixed instrument packages on the bottom, feeding data back to a shore station in real time over fiber. My name was Sung Min Delacroix. I was 28, 2 years into the job, which mostly involved sitting alone in a converted trailer on a bluff overlooking the ocean, watching data streams from instruments 4 kilometers offshore and roughly 3,000 meters down, flagging anomalies for the science team in the morning. The observatory node I monitored most closely was called Station Delta 7, a seafloor package that included a hydrophone array, a set of current meters, water chemistry sensors, and a low-light camera that captured a single still frame every 10 minutes to conserve bandwidth. Most nights, the data was exactly what you'd expect from an abyssal plane. Near total darkness in the camera frames, except for the occasional bioluminescent flash, ambient current noise on the hydrophones, stable temperature and salinity readings that barely moved across an entire shift. I liked the quiet of it. Night shifts at an unmanned observatory station are about as solitary as oceanographic work gets, and I'd grown to prefer it to the crowded research vessels I'd worked on before. The sound that came through the hydrophones at 152 was low frequency, long duration, and loud enough to peg the array's automatic gain control, which is built to handle everything from earthquake microseisms to blue whale calls without clipping. I pulled up the spectrogram, the visual representation of frequency content over time, and the shape of it didn't match anything in the reference library the observatory network maintained for common biological and geological sounds. Whale calls, even the lowest frequency ones from blue and fin whales, have a characteristic structure: frequency modulation, harmonic overtones, a signature shape that trained analysts recognize instantly. This sound was closer to a single sustained tone, dropping slightly in pitch over about 40 seconds, then cutting off abruptly rather than fading, which is itself unusual, since almost nothing in the natural ocean environment produces a sound with a hard stop like that. I logged it as unidentified and pulled the camera frames bracketing the event, since the still camera captured images every 10 minutes regardless of what else was happening. The frame from 150, 2 minutes before the sound, showed the expected scene: dark water, a faint suspension of marine snow drifting past in the strobe flash, the edge of the instrument frame visible at the bottom of frame. The frame from 2 o'clock, 8 minutes after the sound, showed something different. There was a pale, indistinct shape at the very edge of the frame, partially out of the strobe's effective range, that hadn't been present in the previous image. It was impossible to make out real detail. The camera wasn't built for anything beyond documentary snapshots of the immediate seabed, but it was there, and it hadn't been there before, and the observatory's automated change detection software, which flags frame-to-frame differences for review, had already flagged it independently before I'd looked at it myself. I called the on-call science lead, an oceanographer named Priya Ilangovan, the same Priya from an earlier account in this collection, since the deep-sea research community is smaller than people assume, and researchers move between platforms over the course of a career. She'd transitioned from survey vessel work to shore-based observatory science a few years after the incident aboard the Corvid Rise, and when I described what I was seeing, she asked a very specific first question: was the tone I'd recorded a rising or falling frequency? I told her falling, slightly, over about 40 seconds. She was quiet for a moment, and then asked me to send her the spectrogram directly, rather than describing it further. While we were still on the phone, the hydrophones picked up a second tone, structurally identical to the first as far as I could tell in real time, though I'd need the full analysis to confirm that precisely. Priya asked me to check the other observatory nodes in the network. There were 4 seafloor stations spaced roughly 8 kilometers apart along that stretch of margin, to see if any of them had picked up the same signal. 2 of the other 3 stations had. The 4th, the furthest from station Delta 7, showed nothing, which by itself was useful data, since it suggested the source was localized rather than something propagating across the whole margin, like a seismic event would. I want to explain why this mattered so much to Priya, because it mattered to me only once she'd walked me through it. A sound loud enough to register clearly at 2 separate stations 8 kilometers apart, but not at a third station a similar distance further away, implies a directional or localized source rather than a broad geological event. Geological sounds, seafloor spreading, small tremors, gas venting, tend to propagate in patterns that correlate with known fault structures or seep locations, and this stretch of margin had none charted near Delta 7. Biological sounds from known animals have known acoustic signatures. This matched neither category cleanly. Over the next 90 minutes, the tone repeated 4 more times, each occurrence slightly different in duration, but structurally consistent. A sustained frequency dropping slowly, cutting off hard rather than fading. Between the 3rd and 4th occurrence, the current meters at station Delta 7 logged a brief, sharp change in flow direction, a 20-second reversal in bottom current that the instrument's own quality control flags marked as physically implausible given the surrounding readings, since currents at that depth on a flat abyssal plane don't typically reverse direction that abruptly without a major disturbance nearby. Priya asked me to trigger an out-of-cycle camera capture, overriding the 10-minute automated interval, which the system allowed for exactly this kind of situation. I did, twice, 30 seconds apart. The first frame showed nothing unusual, the same dark water and drifting sediment as always. The second frame, 30 seconds later, showed the pale shape again, this time closer to the center of frame, close enough that some structure was visible even in the camera's limited resolution, an elongated form roughly parallel to the seabed, with what might have been a texture variation along its length that could have been read as segmentation or could equally have been a compression artifact in the low-bandwidth image transmission. I sent both frames to Priya immediately. She didn't respond for almost a full minute, which for a working scientist reviewing data in real time is a very long silence. When she came back on the line, she asked me to do something I hadn't expected: shut down the strobe on the camera entirely and let the low-light sensor run passively for 1 full cycle, capturing only ambient bioluminescence rather than an active flash. Most abyssal environments have at least some background bioluminescent activity from disturbed organisms, faint blue-green flashes that a sufficiently sensitive low-light sensor can pick up without any artificial illumination. I switched the mode and waited. 4 minutes later, the passive frame came through. It showed a diffuse trail of faint bioluminescent disturbance, the kind of glow you get when something moves through a field of luminous plankton and agitates them, extending from roughly where the pale shape had appeared in the strobe frame, tracing outward toward the edge of frame in a smooth, continuous line, as though something had passed through that patch of water on a steady, purposeful heading rather than drifting. The tones stopped after 3:40 that morning. The current meters returned to normal baseline readings within the hour. By the time my shift ended at 6, the camera frames were back to the ordinary emptiness the station usually recorded. Dark water, drifting snow, nothing at the edges. I filed a full incident report attached the spectrograms, the camera frames, the current meter logs, everything, and Priya took it to the wider science team for review over the following weeks. The eventual classification entered into the observatory network's permanent database read acoustic and visual anomaly, source unidentified, insufficient data for biological or geological attribution. No further action recommended absent recurrence. It did recur twice more over the following 8 months that I know of, both times on my night shift, both times with the same falling tone acoustic signature and a camera frame showing the same pale, indistinct shape at the edge of the strobe's range. Each time, the science team logged it the same way. Each time, nobody proposed sending a manned vessel or an ROV out to Station Delta 7 specifically to investigate, because the observatory network's entire operating philosophy was built around passive, continuous, low-cost monitoring rather than active response to individual anomalies, and there was no line item in anyone's budget for chasing a sound that stopped every time before a research vessel could reasonably be mobilized. I left the observatory job about a year after my third encounter with the tone, for reasons unrelated to any of this, but I still have copies of the spectrograms on a personal drive, filed under a name only I would recognize, and I still, on quiet nights, find myself thinking about that smooth, continuous trail of disturbed bioluminescence, tracing a straight and steady line through 3,000 meters of absolute dark, toward nothing the camera could ever quite resolve. The pressure hull gauge read 4 psi over expected ambient before we'd even reached working depth, and my dive supervisor made me confirm it twice before we kept descending. I piloted a 2-person submersible for a marine geology research program, ferrying scientists down to inspect hydrothermal vent fields along the Juan de Fuca Ridge. My name was Theodore Marsh Okonkwo. I'd flown that particular submersible, a 3,000-meter rated vehicle called the Halcyon, for 6 years, logging over 400 dives by the time of this account, most of them entirely uneventful science support work. Carry a researcher down, hold station near a vent chimney while they sampled fluid and fauna, come back up on schedule. That dive, my passenger was a vent biologist named Odalise Kwan Fitzgerald, doing survey work on a chemosynthetic community around a vent field the science team had nicknamed Ember Garden, roughly 2,400 meters down. The dive plan called for 4 hours on the bottom, standard for that kind of work, sampling tube worm colonies and measuring fluid temperature and chemistry at several vent orifices across the field. We'd made that same dive together 11 times before, over 2 field seasons. It was, by any reasonable measure, routine. The pressure anomaly at the surface, the 4 CI reading, resolved itself by the time we'd descended past 1,000 meters, and my supervisor on the support ship cleared us to continue, logging it as a probable transducer calibration drift, the kind of minor instrument quirk that shows up occasionally and self-corrects. I noted it in my dive log and thought little more of it. We reached the vent field on schedule, and Odalise began her sampling work while I held the Halcyon in a stable hover about 3 meters off the seabed, close enough for her to work the manipulator arms, far enough to avoid disturbing the fragile chemosynthetic community with our thrusters. Vent fields at that depth are one of the strangest environments on the planet to actually see with your own eyes, rather than in a documentary. Black smoker chimneys venting mineral-laden fluid at temperatures over 300 degrees Celsius, surrounded within meters by dense colonies of tube worms and vent crabs living in water barely above freezing. An entire ecosystem running on chemical energy instead of sunlight. All of it lit only by the Halcyon's floodlights against total blackness. Odalise had spent a career studying places like this, and still, every dive, spent the first few minutes just watching before she started working, which I understood, because 6 years of flying submersibles into these fields had never made the sight of one ordinary to me either. About 90 minutes into the dive, Odalis asked me to reposition slightly so she could reach a cluster of tube worms on the far side of a chimney structure we'd been calling Sentinel, one of the taller formations in the field, maybe 8 meters high. As I brought the Halcyon around, our floodlights swept across a section of the seafloor we hadn't yet surveyed that dive, and Odalis asked me to hold position because she'd seen something in the sweep she wanted to look at more carefully. I brought us to a stop, and she leaned toward the viewport, using her handheld light to supplement the floodlights. What she'd seen was a patch of seafloor, maybe 6 meters across, entirely devoid of the mineral crust and bacterial mat that covered the rest of the vent field's substrate. It looked scoured, almost polished, in a way that didn't match any depositional or erosional pattern either of us had seen in that kind of environment before. Vent fields accumulate mineral precipitate constantly. A bare patch that clean usually meant either very recent volcanic resurfacing, which we'd have detected through other instrumentation, or physical disturbance from something moving across the substrate, with enough consistent contact to strip the accumulated mineral crust down to bare rock. Odalis asked me to hold the Halcyon steady while she photographed the patch systematically, and while she worked, I noticed our external temperature sensor, which monitors ambient seawater temperature outside the hull, distinct from the vent fluid temperature probes she used for her sampling, was reading almost 2 degrees warmer than the baseline we'd established for this part of the field on previous dives. 2 degrees doesn't sound like much, but in an environment where background ambient temperature at that depth normally sits within a few tenths of a degree of near freezing year to year, a 2-degree elevation across a patch of open water away from any known vent orifice is a meaningfully large anomaly. I mentioned it to Odalis. She checked her own handheld probe, which she'd been using to spot-check fluid chemistry near the bare patch, and got a similar elevated reading, though her probe wasn't calibrated for ambient water temperature the way our hull sensor was, so she treated it as a rough confirmation rather than a precise second measurement. She logged it anyway, along with a note that the thermal anomaly correlated spatially with the scoured patch, which in scientific writing is the kind of careful, hedged phrasing that means someone noticed a pattern and isn't yet willing to say out loud what it might mean. We continued the dive plan, moving to the next sampling site, but Odalis asked me to route our return path back past the bare patch before we ascended, so she could do a final visual check. When we came back around, about 2 hours after the first observation, the patch had changed shape. It was no longer roughly circular. It had extended in one direction, a tapering trail perhaps 4 meters long, leading away from the original scoured area toward a jumble of basalt formations at the field's northern edge, the kind of geography a submersible couldn't easily follow without risking the hull or the manipulator arms on jagged rock. The trail looked, in the most literal sense I can offer, like something had passed across the seafloor and left the ground scraped clean behind it. Odalis wanted photographs of the trail's full length before we ascended, and I held station while she worked the external camera controls, panning along the trail's path. About 2/3 of the way through that survey, our external temperature sensor spiked again, this time by nearly 3 degrees over baseline, and simultaneously the Halcyon's low-frequency active sonar, normally used for obstacle avoidance near the seabed, returned a contact at the edge of its effective range, close to the basalt jumble where the trail terminated, too indistinct at that range for shape resolution, but registering as a solid mass roughly the size of the submersible itself. I made the call to end the dive at that point, which was within my authority as pilot, regardless of what science objectives remained. And Odalise didn't argue, though she kept the external camera running and recording as I began our ascent sequence, floodlights sweeping the seafloor one last time as we lifted off the bottom. In the recorded footage, reviewed later on the surface, there's a section lasting perhaps 4 seconds, right as we cleared the top of the basalt formations, where something crosses the very bottom edge of frame, pale, elongated, moving with what the science team's later frame-by-frame analysis described as non-random directional intent, which is an unusually direct phrase for a peer-reviewed observation log, and which Odalise told me afterward she'd insisted on keeping in the write-up over an editor's objection that it sounded too speculative. The ascent itself was uneventful. We surfaced on schedule 4 hours and 11 minutes after splashdown, well within normal dive parameters. The support ship's technicians found nothing mechanically wrong with the Halcyon during post-dive inspection. No damage to the hull, no anomalies in any onboard system beyond the temperature sensor readings already logged. The bare patch and its trail were revisited by a different submersible team 6 weeks later, on a follow-up dive specifically tasked with documenting the feature for the geology team. By then, according to that dive's report, the patch had been almost entirely recolonized by bacterial matte and fresh mineral precipitate, consistent with roughly 6 to 8 weeks of undisturbed regrowth, which meant whatever had scoured it clean in the first place had not returned to that exact spot in the interim, or had simply left no further trace if it had. Odalise published a short note about the thermal anomaly and the scoured substrate pattern in a vent ecology journal the following year, carefully framed around possible undocumented megafauna behavior, with the 4 seconds of footage included as supplementary material and described, in the driest possible academic language, as an unidentified moving object of uncertain biological origin. I still fly submersibles for research programs, though not for that particular institution anymore, and I've been back to vent fields dozens of times since without anything similar happening. But I still check the external temperature sensor more carefully than I used to on every single dive, and I've never quite lost the instinct, whenever a patch of seafloor looks a little too clean, to ask whoever I'm flying with to just hold still a moment longer before we move on. The black box we were sent to recover had been on the seafloor for 6 years, and nobody expected the retrieval to be the strange part of the job. I worked for a marine salvage and recovery contractor that specialized in locating and retrieving aircraft and vessel wreckage from deep water, work that mostly involved long stretches of side-scan survey, followed by ROV recovery operations once a target was confirmed. My name was Farida Osei Lindquist. I'd spent 9 years in that line of work by the time of this account, and by then I'd been part of maybe a dozen successful black box recoveries, along with dozens more surveys that turned up nothing at all, which is the more common outcome in that business than anyone outside it tends to realize. The job that season was a private contract, funded by an insurance consortium trying to close out a long-standing claim on a cargo vessel that had gone down in a storm 6 years earlier in the Eastern Pacific, roughly 4,200 meters down. The vessel's voyage data recorder, the maritime equivalent of an aircraft black box, had never been recovered despite 2 earlier survey attempts by other contractors, both of which had failed to relocate the wreck site precisely enough for retrieval. We were the 3rd attempt, working off improved side-scan data and a narrower search box than either of the previous teams had used. We found the wreck on day 9 of the survey, sitting upright on a relatively flat stretch of seabed, largely intact given the depth and the violence of the sinking, which our marine architect on board attributed to the vessel having gone down mostly level rather than breaking apart on the surface first. The voyage data recorder was mounted, per standard maritime practice, near the bridge structure in a protective housing designed to survive exactly this kind of scenario. Our ROV team began the recovery operation the following day, a slow, careful process of maneuvering a work-class vehicle through debris and structural hazard to reach the housing without damaging it. The ROV pilot on that operation was a woman named Priya Ilangovan, and I want to note again, since it will come up more than once in this collection, that the deep-sea research and survey community really is small enough that the same handful of experienced people rotate through different platforms and companies over a career, which is why her name appears in more than one of these accounts. By the time she worked with us, she'd moved from academic oceanography into commercial ROV piloting, bringing a level of careful, methodical caution to the work that our operations manager specifically valued for a delicate recovery job like this one. The recovery itself, on the technical side, went almost exactly as planned. Priya guided the ROV's manipulator arms through the extraction procedure, cutting away corroded mounting brackets, carefully freeing the recorder housing from 6 years of marine growth and sediment accumulation, and bringing it into the ROV's recovery basket without incident. The strange part started afterward, during what should have been the simplest phase of the operation, the ascent back to the surface with the recovered unit secured. At roughly 2,900 meters on the way up, the ROV's sonar, which we ran continuously during ascent partly for obstacle avoidance and partly out of habit, since the water column above a deep wreck site sometimes holds debris that's drifted up from the seabed, picked up a contact below and slightly astern of the vehicle's position. Priya flagged it in the operational log as routine, since water column contacts near wreck sites aren't unusual, often turning out to be fish aggregations drawn to a wreck structure as an artificial reef feature over years. She continued the ascent on the planned profile. The contact stayed with us, not constantly at the same range. It varied between roughly 40 and 90 meters below the ROV over the course of the ascent, but it never fully dropped off the sonar display, which over a controlled ascent lasting the better part of an hour is unusual for anything drifting on its own, since ambient current at different depths typically disperses a loose aggregation of fish rather than keeping it coherent across a kilometer or more of vertical transit. Priya noted this in the log at the halfway point of the ascent, flagging it as worth reviewing afterward rather than as an immediate operational concern, since nothing about the ROV's systems or the recovery basket's security was affected. At around 1,400 meters, the ship's hull-mounted sonar, a separate, more powerful system used for general water column monitoring, distinct from the ROV's own onboard unit, independently picked up the same contact, confirming it wasn't an artifact isolated to the ROV's tethered system. Our sonar operator on that watch, a young technician who'd only been with the company a few months, called it up to the bridge with a note of uncertainty in her voice that I remember clearly because it was the first time that trip anyone had sounded genuinely unsettled rather than simply professionally curious. She described the contact as maintaining an almost constant depth offset beneath the ascending ROV, adjusting its own depth to track the ROV's ascent rate closely enough that the vertical separation between them stayed within a fairly narrow band for extended stretches, rather than the wandering, inconsistent separation you'd expect from something simply drifting in the same general water mass. Priya, from the ROV control van, asked permission to pause the ascent briefly at 900 meters to assess, rather than continuing straight to the surface with an unidentified contact shadowing the vehicle the entire way up. Our operations manager approved it, She held the ROV in a stationary hover for about 4 minutes, during which the sonar contact also stopped closing or opening range, settling into a hold pattern roughly 70 meters below, which, if it had simply been a current-driven mass of drifting debris or fish, should not have been possible, since a stationary ROV in open water has no obvious reason to hold a coherent formation of drifting material at a fixed distance beneath it. During that hold, Priya angled the ROV's downward-facing camera, normally used for seabed approach work, to look straight down into the water column below the vehicle. The floodlights at that range illuminated perhaps 20 meters of clear water before fading into blackness, well short of the 70-meter separation the sonar was reporting, so nothing was visible directly. But at the very edge of the lit cone, for a period the recorded footage later confirmed at just under 3 seconds, something crossed laterally through the bottom of frame, pale, low profile, moving fast enough that even at 3 seconds of exposure, the shape blurred across multiple frames, rather than resolving into anything the science team could later characterize with confidence. Priya resumed the ascent immediately after that, running the ROV at close to its maximum vertical speed rather than the more conservative rate used earlier, a deviation from standard procedure that nobody on the bridge questioned, given what the sonar and camera had just shown. The contact kept pace for another 2 minutes before dropping away from the ROV's sonar range entirely at around 400 meters, and it never reappeared on either the ROV's onboard system or the ship's hull sonar for the remainder of the ascent, which took the vehicle and the recovered voyage data recorder safely back to the surface and up onto the deck without further incident. The recorder itself was handed over to the insurance consortium's technical team, who successfully extracted usable data from it, despite 6 years of submersion, closing out the claim investigation that had funded the entire job. Nothing in the recorder's data had anything to do with what we'd encountered on the ascent, since it was purely a maritime voyage recorder logging navigation and engine data from 6 years earlier, entirely unrelated to whatever had shadowed our ROV on the way up. Priya's incident report on the sonar contact and the camera footage was filed separately, reviewed internally by our operations team, and ultimately closed with the same kind of language that seems to follow every account in this line of work. Unidentified contact, biological or unknown, insufficient data for further characterization, no operational impact to recovery objectives. I asked Priya afterward, over drinks in port a few days later, what she actually thought had been down there with us during that hour-long ascent. She said the thing that stuck with her wasn't the sonar contact itself, or even the brief glimpse on camera, but the way it had held station so precisely during those 4 minutes when the ROV stopped moving, not closing distance, not retreating, just holding, the way something patient holds, waiting to see what happens next before deciding what to do about it. She said in almost 20 years of deep-sea work, across academic research and now commercial salvage, that was the detail she still thought about more than any of the others. Not that something had been there, that it had known exactly how to wait. I was the environmental monitoring officer aboard an offshore wind foundation installation vessel when the seabed survey drone stopped responding for the first time, 40 minutes into what should have been a 2-hour pre-installation sweep. My name was Otieno Kasperzak. I'd worked marine environmental compliance for 8 years by then, most of it involving exactly the kind of unglamorous, heavily regulated survey work that offshore renewable energy projects require before any construction can begin. Seabed habitat mapping, protected species monitoring, sediment sampling, all of it documented in exhaustive detail to satisfy permitting requirements. My job existed to make sure a wind farm foundation didn't go into the water on top of something it shouldn't, ecologically speaking, and most days that meant staring at survey data looking for exactly nothing unusual, because unusual meant delays, and delays meant expensive vessel time burning against a fixed construction schedule. The site was a proposed foundation location roughly 60 kilometers off the coast, in about 210 meters of water, which put it at the deeper end of what commercial offshore wind development was attempting at that point, on the edge of a technology push into deeper foundation designs. The survey drone, a small autonomous underwater vehicle we used for detailed seabed characterization ahead of the larger construction vessels, had been running a standard lawnmower survey pattern over the proposed foundation footprint, an area roughly 200 meters square, logging sediment composition, bathymetry, and any visible protected habitat features like cold water coral or sensitive benthic communities that would trigger a mandatory relocation of the entire foundation. The AUV's telemetry cut out at 40 minutes into the survey, which wasn't itself alarming. That class of vehicle often ran survey legs beyond direct acoustic communication range from the support vessel, operating autonomously on a pre-programmed track and only surfacing to transmit full data once the mission was complete. What was slightly unusual was that the vehicle's periodic status pings, short low-bandwidth confirmations it was programmed to send every 5 minutes, even while out of full telemetry range, stopped arriving on schedule. The fifth one came in 9 minutes late. The sixth didn't come at all. I flagged it to the vessel's survey superintendent, a methodical woman named Delphine Achterberg, who'd run AUV operations for longer than almost anyone else in the offshore wind sector. And she made the call to launch a recovery attempt using the ship's acoustic tracking system rather than waiting out the full mission duration, since a missed status ping on that particular vehicle model usually indicated either a navigation fault or a genuine equipment failure worth investigating promptly rather than risking loss of an expensive asset. The acoustic tracking system located the AUV without much difficulty. It was still transmitting its basic locator beacon, just not the richer telemetry stream, sitting almost stationary at a depth of 198 meters, close to but not exactly on its programmed survey track, drifting only slightly with the current rather than continuing its mission pattern. Delphine's working theory at that point was a propulsion fault, something mechanical that had left the vehicle unable to continue its programmed route, while its basic systems, including the locator beacon, kept functioning on backup power. We recovered the AUV about 90 minutes later using the vessel's launch and recovery system, and once it was back on deck, our technician began a full diagnostic before anyone touched the survey data. The vehicle's propulsion system tested fully functional, no fault detected. Its navigation computer, however, showed something the technician flagged immediately: a navigation log entry time-stamped during the outage window recording an emergency stop command issued by the vehicle's own onboard collision avoidance system, which is designed to halt forward motion automatically if the vehicle's obstacle detection sonar registers something in its path close enough to represent an imminent collision risk. That was the part that made Delphine pull the full sensor logs immediately, rather than treating this as routine equipment troubleshooting. An AUV of that class doesn't typically trigger a hard emergency stop in open water over a flat, previously mapped seabed with no known obstructions. The whole reason the collision avoidance system exists is for edge cases like unexpected debris or steep, uncharted terrain features, situations that are genuinely uncommon on a pre-surveyed installation site that had already been through an initial reconnaissance pass months earlier, showing nothing but flat sediment. The onboard obstacle detection sonar log showed a return, appearing directly in the vehicle's forward path at a range of about 6 meters, close enough to trigger the automatic stop under the system's programmed safety margins. The return's shape data, as best the AUV's relatively limited onboard processing could characterize it, suggested something roughly 3 meters across, low profile, resting on or very near the seabed. The vehicle, per its programming, had held station rather than attempting to navigate around the obstacle on its own, since its autonomy software wasn't designed for improvised route replanning around unexpected contacts. It was built to detect a hazard, stop, and wait for either the hazard to clear or a human operator to intervene, which in this case meant waiting the better part of an hour with its status pings quietly failing to reach the surface, for reasons the diagnostic couldn't fully explain, since the acoustic modem itself tested as fully functional once recovered. Delphine reviewed the AUV's onboard camera footage from the stop window next, since the vehicle carried a forward-facing camera primarily meant for documenting seabed features of interest rather than active hazard investigation. Most of that footage showed exactly what you'd expect from a stationary vehicle holding position in open water at 198 meters, a narrow cone of illuminated water fading to black, the faint drift of suspended sediment, nothing dramatic. But roughly 31 minutes into the 54-minute stop, something entered the frame from the lower left, low and close to the seabed, moving slowly across the bottom edge of the illuminated area before exiting frame roughly 11 seconds later. I watched that 11 seconds more times than I'm willing to admit over the following weeks. It doesn't resolve into anything with confident detail. The AUV's camera wasn't built for anything beyond documentary habitat imagery, and 11 seconds at that resolution and that range gives you shape and movement more than texture or structure. But it moves with a low, deliberate gait across the bottom of frame, pausing once, briefly, in a way that reads, and I want to be honest, that this is interpretation rather than measurement, as though it had noticed the vehicle's lights and was orienting toward them before continuing on its original path and passing out of frame. The AUV resumed its status pings normally about 90 seconds after that 11-second window, and its emergency stop cleared shortly afterward, the onboard collision avoidance system logging the forward path as clear and resuming its programmed survey pattern on its own, exactly as designed, with no further anomalies for the remainder of the mission. When we recovered it and reviewed everything together, Delphine made the decision to halt the survey for the day and reposition the vessel to run the remaining transects the following morning, with a support diver-operated camera drone running alongside the AUV for direct human observation. A significant and expensive change to the operational plan that she had to justify to the project's onshore management, which she did using exactly the plain, procedural language regulatory compliance work runs on. Unidentified contact, triggering automated safety protocol. Recommend direct visual confirmation of habitat conditions before resuming autonomous survey operations. The following day's survey, run with direct camera oversight, showed nothing unusual across the entire proposed Foundation footprint. Flat sediment, unremarkable habitat, no protected species, nothing that would have triggered a relocation of the Foundation design. The site was cleared for construction, and the wind turbine foundation was installed there the following season without further incident, standing today as one of dozens across that development, its precise coordinates a matter of public regulatory record that I still, occasionally, look up on a map and think about, remembering 11 seconds of grainy footage and a shape that paused, once, as though deciding whether the light was worth investigating further, before choosing to move on into water our instruments were never built to follow it into. The bathyscap's ballast system started venting on its own at 9,000 meters, deep enough that for a while none of us said anything at all, because there was nothing useful to say, and every bit of attention available needed to go toward figuring out why. I served as chief pilot on a privately funded full ocean depth research submersible, a two-person vehicle built for scientific dives into the deepest trenches on the planet, well beyond the range of almost any other manned vehicle in operation. My name was Ingrid Halvorsen Boatima. I'd trained for 9 years before ever piloting a dive to that depth class solo, and by the time of this account I'd completed 11 dives beyond 8,000 meters, a number that put me among a genuinely small handful of people who had ever been that deep in a crewed vehicle in the entire history of ocean exploration. That dive's objective was straightforward on paper: descend to the floor of a subduction trench roughly 10,200 meters down, collect sediment and water samples for a geochemistry team studying deep Hadal ecosystems, spend approximately 90 minutes on the bottom, and ascend. My passenger for the dive was a Hadal Zone microbiologist named Reinhold Ackerli Sundquist, on his third dive with me over 2 field seasons, methodical and quiet in the way that people who work in extreme environments tend to become, since panic and excessive chatter both cost you focus you can't afford to lose down there. The descent itself was routine for the first 90 minutes, the pressure hull creaking with the ordinary, expected sounds of increasing external pressure, the water outside our small viewport shifting from deep blue to black, somewhere around 1,000 meters, and after that, nothing but our own lights and the occasional bioluminescent flash for the remainder of the descent. At 9,040 meters, according to the depth gauge, the ballast control system's status panel showed an unscheduled valve actuation, venting a small quantity of compressed air from one of the trim tanks without any command input from either Reinhold or myself. I want to explain briefly why this mattered so much more than it would in a shallower vehicle. A full ocean depth submersible's ballast and trim system is about as carefully engineered and redundantly monitored as anything on the vehicle, because at that depth, with roughly 1,000 atmospheres of pressure bearing on the hull, there is no meaningful margin for error in buoyancy control. An unscheduled valve actuation, even a small one, needed to be understood immediately, because the difference between a controlled dive and an uncontrolled one at that depth is the entire difference between a career and a catastrophe. I ran the diagnostic sequence immediately, checking the valve's command log against the actual actuation timestamp. The log showed no command sent by the onboard control computer, no manual input from either of our control stations, nothing in the system's own record explaining why the valve had opened. I closed the valve manually and confirmed our trim was still within safe parameters, which it was. The vented air had been a small enough quantity that our overall buoyancy profile remained sound, but the fact that it had happened at all, with no traceable cause, was the kind of anomaly that in almost a decade of full ocean depth diving I had never personally encountered. I informed the surface support ship over our through-water acoustic communication link, a slow, low-bandwidth text-based system that was the only communication method available at that depth, since radio doesn't penetrate seawater and voice-grade acoustic links become impractical beyond a few thousand meters. The surface team, led that dive by a support engineer named Delphine Achterberg, who by this point in her career had moved between offshore wind survey work and deep submersible support operations, another instance of how small this professional world really is, acknowledged the anomaly and asked whether we wanted to abort. Reinhold and I discussed it briefly. The valve was closed, trim was stable, and we were less than 40 minutes from our target depth. we elected to continue, with the surface team monitoring our trim telemetry more closely than usual for the remainder of the descent. We reached the trench floor at 10,188 meters, settling gently onto the bottom in a small cloud of disturbed sediment that took almost a full minute to clear in the still water, since at that depth there is essentially no current to disperse it. What our floodlights revealed once the sediment settled was, as it almost always is at that depth, close to featureless, a flat, pale expanse of fine sediment, extending as far as our lights could reach, punctuated occasionally by the pale, slow-moving forms of the specialized amphipods and holothurians that make up most of the visible life at Hadal depths. Reinhold began his sampling work, extending the manipulator arm to collect sediment cores and deploy a small water sampler at several points around our position. Work that at that depth requires patience measured in minutes per movement rather than seconds, since every mechanical action at that pressure runs slower and more deliberately than it would in shallower, more forgiving conditions. About 20 minutes into the sampling sequence, our external sonar, a short-range system used primarily for docking and obstacle avoidance near the seabed, registered a contact approaching from beyond the reach of our floodlights, moving slowly, on a heading that would bring it past our position at a range of roughly 30 meters. At that depth, in that environment, a sonar contact of any significant size is itself remarkable, since the biomass supportable in Hadal Trench ecosystems is generally very low, and anything large enough to register clearly on a short-range sonar system represents either an unusually large specimen of a known species or something entirely outside the existing catalogue of Hadal fauna. Reinhold paused his sampling work to watch the display with me. The contact held its distance for several minutes, neither closing nor retreating, before beginning a slow circuit around our position, staying just beyond the effective range of our floodlights the entire time, a pattern that by that point in this collection of accounts, and by that point in my own career, I recognized as something more than coincidental drifting. I made the decision to hold our position rather than attempt to maneuver toward the contact for a closer look, since the entire submersible's design philosophy at that depth prioritizes stability and predictability over investigative curiosity, and 9 years of training had thoroughly instilled in me the understanding that at 10,000 meters, the vehicle's own safety margins take absolute priority over scientific opportunism, however tempting a closer look might be. The contact completed a full circuit of our position over roughly 11 minutes according to the sonar log's timestamps, before beginning to close distance, slowly, in a straight approach rather than continuing the circling pattern. At a range of about 15 meters, close enough that the edge of our floodlight cone finally began to catch something, Reinhold and I both saw, simultaneously, a pale shape resolve at the very limit of visibility, elongated, low, moving with a slow, undulating gait across the sediment that neither of us, in a combined total of well over 2 decades of deep ocean experience between us, could confidently attribute to any catalogued Hadal species. Reinhold's professional assessment, offered quietly and without any drama in his voice, was that the estimated size, he put it at somewhere between 4 and 6 meters based on the portion visible against our light, exceeded the largest confirmed specimens of any organism previously documented at that depth by a significant margin. The shape held at roughly 12 meters range for almost 90 seconds, neither advancing further nor retreating, and in that 90 seconds, neither Reinhold nor I said a single word to each other, both of us simply watching through the small viewport, our own breathing the loudest sound in the cramped pressure hull. Then, without any visible propulsive motion that either of us could describe afterward with confidence, it withdrew back beyond the edge of our lights and did not reappear on sonar again for the remainder of our time on the bottom. We completed the sampling mission, cutting our bottom time roughly 15 minutes short of the full 90-minute plan by mutual unspoken agreement, and began our ascent. The ballast system functioned without further anomaly for the entire return to the surface, a nearly 4-hour process at that depth class, and we surfaced without incident. The recovered samples handed over to Reinholdt's team for analysis. The sonar logs and our own testimony handed over to the expedition's chief scientist for a report that, like every report in this collection, ultimately concluded with careful, hedged language about an unidentified organism of uncertain taxonomic status, insufficient data for formal classification. I've made 6 more full ocean depth dives since that one, none of them anywhere near that particular trench, and none of them producing anything remotely similar. Reinholdt, the last I heard, had shifted his research focus toward Hadal microbial communities almost exclusively, working increasingly from sediment cores collected by autonomous landers rather than crewed dives, though he never told me directly why, and I never asked. I still think, more often than I'd like to admit, about those 90 seconds of stillness at 12 meters range, 10,188 meters down, in a place where the pressure alone would kill a human being instantly and completely without a hull between them and the water, and something out there had simply been standing, or its equivalent of standing, watching our lights, deciding, in whatever way something like that decides anything, whether we were worth the effort of coming any closer. The mooring line snapped clean through at 1,900 meters, and the strange part wasn't that it broke. It was what the recovered end looked like when we finally got it back on deck. I worked as chief technician aboard a scientific mooring servicing vessel, responsible for deploying, maintaining, and recovering long-term oceanographic mooring arrays, vertical lines anchored to the seafloor, strung with instrument packages at various depths, designed to sit in place collecting data continuously for months or years at a time before a servicing cruise like ours came out to recover the data, replace batteries, and redeploy. My name was Callum Reyes, the same Callum from the saturation diving account earlier in this collection, since after that dive he moved out of commercial saturation work into mooring servicing, a career shift he told me more than once he'd made, specifically because it kept him in daylight-adjacent depths and away from the black water below 300 meters. This account happened 4 years after that one, and it is, in its own way, the reason he eventually left ocean work altogether. The mooring array we were servicing that trip sat in about 4,200 meters of water in the eastern Pacific, part of a long-term climate monitoring program that had maintained instrument lines in that location for over a decade. The array consisted of a single vertical mooring line anchored to a large concrete block on the seafloor, strung with a dozen instrument packages at staggered depths from near surface down to about 3,800 meters, all held taut by a subsurface flotation package near the top. Recovery of a mooring like this involves sending an acoustic release command to the anchor, which detaches the line from the seafloor block and allows the flotation to carry the entire instrument string up to the surface, where the ship's crew hauls it aboard. The release command went out normally, and the acoustic transponder on the anchor confirmed release, exactly as it should. What should have followed was a predictable, calculable ascent, the flotation package rising at a known rate, the whole string trailing beneath it, surfacing within a tight time window our team could predict almost to the minute based on the flotation's buoyancy and the total line length. Instead, nothing surfaced. We waited past the expected window, then well past it, our surface watch scanning the horizon with binoculars for the flotation buoy's marker flag and radio beacon, both of which should have been active and transmitting the moment the package broke the surface. The mooring's acoustic transponder was still transmitting from below, which told us the release mechanism itself had functioned and the anchor was no longer attached to the seafloor. But the depth reading it reported, when our sonar operator pinged it for a range and depth confirmation, showed the transponder holding at a depth of roughly 1,900 meters, not moving, not ascending, for almost 40 minutes after release, which should have been physically impossible given the flotation package's rated buoyancy, more than sufficient to lift the entire instrument string to the surface in well under half that time under any normal circumstance. Our chief scientist on that cruise, an oceanographer overseeing the climate monitoring program, made the call to send our work-class ROV down to investigate rather than simply waiting indefinitely for a physically impossible situation to resolve itself. Callum, by then an experienced ROV pilot in addition to his mooring servicing duties, took the controls. I worked alongside him in the control van that day, monitoring instrument telemetry and logging the dive. The ROV located the mooring string at roughly 1,900 meters within about 20 minutes of descent, exactly where the transponder had been reporting. What we found, once the floodlights picked it out of the dark, was the flotation package and the topmost several instrument canisters, tangled and motionless, apparently caught on something rather than continuing their ascent, though there was, as far as we could see on camera, nothing around them at that depth to catch on. Open water at 1,900 meters over a 4,200 meter seafloor has nothing solid for a rising mooring line to snag on. That's the entire premise of why moorings are deployed in open water in the first place, precisely to avoid entanglement hazards. Callum brought the ROV closer, and as he did, our sonar picked up a contact below the tangled mooring line, close enough in range that at first he assumed it was some kind of return, bouncing off the mooring gear itself, rather than a separate object. He adjusted the ROV's angle to get a clean read, and the contact resolved as distinct from the mooring line, positioned perhaps 15 meters below the tangled instrument string, holding steady, not moving. I want to walk through what happened over the next several minutes carefully, because this is the part of the account that, out of everything I've described in these stories, still sits with me the most vividly, years later. Callum brought the ROV down toward the contact slowly, floodlights sweeping the water ahead, and at a range of about 8 meters, the lights caught what our subsequent frame-by-frame review confirmed was a length of the mooring line itself, wrapped, there is no better word for it, around something. Not snagged accidentally on a protrusion, which is what tangled mooring gear usually looks like when you find it caught on wreckage or an uncharted rock outcrop, but wrapped in a way that our chief scientist, reviewing the footage afterward with 3 decades of mooring deployment and recovery experience behind her, said she had never once seen in her career. Several complete turns of heavy-gauge synthetic line wound around a mass that our camera, at that range and in that light, could only partially resolve, pale and thick along one visible section, disappearing into shadow beyond the edge of the floodlight cone in both directions. Callum held the ROV steady rather than approaching further and asked the chief scientist over the intercom to the bridge how she wanted to proceed. There was a long pause before she answered, long enough that I remember checking the ROV's own systems to make sure we hadn't lost her transmission. When she came back, she said something I've turned over many times since. She said the instrument data on that mooring line represented 11 years of continuous climate monitoring at that site, effectively irreplaceable. And she needed to know honestly from us whether attempting to free it and recover it was something we felt we could do safely, because she would rather lose 11 years of data than risk the ROV, or risk whatever judgment call Callum needed to make down there in real time, with better information than any of us on the bridge actually had. Callum made the decision to attempt a careful cut rather than a full unwrapping, using the ROV's manipulator-mounted cutting tool to sever the mooring line as close as he safely could to the tangled mass, freeing the flotation package and instrument string to continue its interrupted ascent, while leaving whatever the line was wrapped around undisturbed, rather than risking a prolonged, close-range manipulation to fully free it. He positioned the cutting tool with the same careful, deliberate patience I'd watched him bring to every technical task since the day I first worked with him, made the cut, and immediately backed the ROV away rather than lingering to observe. The freed instrument string began its interrupted ascent within seconds of the cut, rising at close to its expected buoyant rate, and surfaced roughly 40 minutes later, exactly where our calculations would have predicted if the original release had simply gone according to plan, without whatever had happened at 1,900 meters. The recovered instrument packages were intact and had continued logging data throughout the entire delay, giving the science team a complete, uninterrupted 11-year dataset despite the anomaly, which was in its own way the best possible outcome of an extremely strange several hours. The severed end of mooring line, still attached to the recovered instrument string when it came aboard, was the detail that stayed with everyone on that cruise longest. The synthetic line, rated for a working load well beyond anything a passive entanglement should have subjected it to, showed clean, even wear marks along roughly 1.5 meters of its length, immediately above the cut Callum had made. Not frayed, not chafed against rock, but smoothed and slightly compressed in a way our rigging specialist, examining it on deck, said matched nothing in her considerable experience with mooring line failure modes, except, she said reluctantly, the kind of wear pattern you sometimes see online that's been under sustained, deliberate tension from something actively holding it rather than simply caught on a fixed obstruction. The ROV's sonar never picked up the contact again for the remainder of that cruise, though our watch schedule after that day kept a permanent secondary sonar operator monitoring the water column continuously during every subsequent operation, a policy change the chief scientist implemented without much explanation beyond citing an abundance of caution. The mooring array was redeployed at a slightly different position the following season, several kilometers from the original site. A relocation, the program's funding proposal attributed diplomatically to updated bathymetric survey requirements, rather than to anything that had happened at 1,900 meters the year before. Callum left ocean work entirely about 18 months after that cruise, moving into a shore-based instrumentation role with the same company, and though we've stayed close over the years, he's told me only once, late one night with more honesty than he usually allows himself about it, that what actually decided him wasn't the 8 meters of visibility or the pale shadow beyond the light. It was the 40 minutes the transponder sat motionless at 1,900 meters before we ever sent the ROV down, all of us on the bridge assuming some kind of straightforward mechanical failure, while whatever was actually holding that line simply waited, patiently, in the dark, for something with lights to come and see what it had caught. The dredge came up 1/2 ton lighter than it should have been, and nobody on the survey crew could explain where the missing weight had gone. I worked as a marine geologist aboard a scientific coring vessel doing seabed sediment sampling for a paleoclimate research program, collecting long sediment cores from the abyssal plain to reconstruct thousands of years of ocean history layer by layer. My name was Marisol Achterberg Delacroix. I'd spent 14 years in sediment coring work by the time of this account, most of it entirely uneventful in the way good science usually is. You lower an instrument, you bring it back up. You measure and log exactly what you expected to find, and the excitement, when there is any, comes from what the data reveals months later in a lab, rather than from anything dramatic happening at sea. Our vessel, the research ship Holden Reach, was working a site in the North Atlantic in about 3,600 meters of water, using a piston corer, a heavy, weighted tube system designed to punch deep into soft sediment and extract an intact core sample showing undisturbed layers going back potentially tens of thousands of years. It's unglamorous, heavy equipment work. You lower several tons of steel and weights on a wire, let it free fall the last several meters to drive the coring tube into the mud, and winch the whole assembly back up, hoping the core barrel retained its sample intact. That particular deployment, our fourth of the trip, went down exactly according to procedure. The winch operator, a steady, experienced man named Desmond Okafor, again, a name recurring across this collection, since Desmond had transitioned from bridge watch work on survey vessels to specialized winch operation over the years, another of the many small overlaps that happen in a professional community this size, logged the wire tension readings throughout the descent, watching for the characteristic slack that indicates the corer has hit bottom and begun its penetration. That slack registered right on schedule at a wire-out length consistent with our known water depth. The trouble started during recovery. A piston corer's weight on the wire, once it's clear of the bottom and rising through open water, is a known, predictable quantity. The total assembled weight of the corer, the core barrel, the sample it's carrying, and the trigger weight system, all of which our winch tension gauge tracks continuously, and which Desmond, after years of doing this exact job, could estimate almost as accurately by feel as the instrument could measure it. About halfway through the recovery, at roughly 1,800 meters of wire in, the tension gauge showed a drop of nearly 500 kilograms, sudden enough that Desmond immediately stopped the winch rather than continuing to haul, worried the sudden loss of tension meant a wire parting or a shackle failure somewhere in the rigging that could send the entire assembly crashing back to the seafloor and taking a section of wire with it. He held the winch stationary and had our deck crew visually inspect what was visible of the wire at the surface for any obvious damage, finding none, before very cautiously resuming the haul at reduced speed, watching the tension gauge continuously. It held steady at the reduced weight for the remainder of the recovery. No further drops, nothing suggesting an active mechanical problem, which left everyone on deck with the considerably stranger question of where exactly 500 kilograms of steel coring equipment had simply gone. When the corer finally broke the surface and was swung aboard by the vessel's A-frame, the answer, or at least part of it, was immediately visible. The corer's trigger weight assembly, a separate, heavy-weighted mechanism that rides alongside the main core barrel and is designed to release and trigger the piston mechanism upon touching bottom, was gone entirely. Not damaged, not bent, not partially attached by a stretched or broken connector. The mounting bracket that had secured it to the main assembly was intact and undamaged, its attachment bolts still in place, but the trigger weight itself, close to 450 kilograms of solid steel, was simply absent, as though it had never been mounted there at all, despite the fact that our deck log and photographs from before deployment clearly showed it properly secured. Our chief scientist on that cruise, a paleoclimatologist named Reinhold Ackerli Sundquist, whose research career had by then spanned everything from Hadal trench dives to shipboard sediment coring, examined the mounting bracket personally alongside Desmond, and both of them independently reached the same uneasy conclusion. There was no mechanical failure mode either of them could identify that would separate a properly bolted 450 kilogram steel weight from its mount, while leaving the bolts themselves, fully seated and undamaged. A shear failure, a fatigue crack, a manufacturing defect. Any of those would leave physical evidence on the bracket and the bolts, damaged threads, stress fractures, something. There was nothing. It looked, in Reinholdt's own words, logged verbatim in the cruise report, as though the weight had simply been removed by hand, deliberately and cleanly, at depth. We recovered the core barrel itself intact, and the sediment sample inside it turned out to be scientifically excellent, a clean, undisturbed core, showing beautifully preserved layering, which meant, oddly, that whatever had happened to the trigger weight hadn't disrupted the actual coring operation at all. The corer had clearly still functioned correctly, triggering and penetrating the sediment as designed, which raised the further question of when, exactly, in the sequence of events, the weight had gone missing, during the descent, during the bottom time, or sometime during the ascent, since the trigger mechanism itself needed the weight to function as designed in the first place, and yet had apparently worked normally regardless. Reinholdt made the decision to review our sub-bottom profiler data, a continuous acoustic recording of the seafloor and the water column immediately above it, that the ship ran throughout every coring operation, mostly for navigational and geological reference, rather than as any kind of active monitoring tool. Buried in that data, time-stamped to correspond almost exactly with the wire tension drop Desmond had recorded during recovery, was a brief acoustic anomaly in the water column roughly 1,800 meters below the ship, a diffuse, momentary return that the profiler's automated processing software had flagged as likely biological noise and essentially ignored, the way it ignored dozens of similar minor flags on any given survey day, since fish and other marine life register constantly on that kind of equipment without being individually significant. What made this particular flag worth a second look, once Reinholdt went digging, was its precise correlation with the tension drop, down to within about 4 seconds, and its unusual acoustic signature, a return with far more mass and coherence than the fish schools or scattering layers the software typically filtered as routine, close enough in scale, by the analysis our onboard acoustics specialist ran afterward, to plausibly correspond to something on the order of the missing weight's dimensions, though nobody on that cruise was willing to put that comparison in the official cruise report in anything but the most hedged, careful language. We continued the coring program for the remainder of the trip, 3 more successful deployments over the following 5 days, all of them entirely uneventful, all of their trigger weights recovered fully intact and properly secured exactly as deployed. Desmond told me privately, near the end of the cruise, that he'd started doing something he'd never done in over a decade of winch operation before that trip, watching the tension gauge personally through every single foot of every recovery from that point forward, rather than trusting the automated alarm thresholds the way he always had before, because he said he never again wanted to be the one who found out 500 kilograms had quietly vanished from the end of his wire only after the fact. The missing trigger weight was never recovered, never explained in any way the cruise report was willing to commit to in writing, beyond noting a probable equipment failure of undetermined mechanism, insurance claim filed and settled routinely by the institution that owned the equipment. The whole incident closed out administratively within a few months, in a way that left no permanent record beyond the raw data logs and the private, unofficial memory of everyone who'd stood on that deck, watching a heavy steel weight simply not be there anymore, its mounting bolts sitting patient and undamaged, and entirely, perfectly undisturbed. We lost contact with the lander for 11 minutes, and when the signal came back, its internal clock was 34 minutes fast, a discrepancy nobody aboard the ship was ever able to explain. I served as the lead engineer for an autonomous benthic lander program, deploying free-fall instrument packages to the seafloor to record extended time series data on deep ocean conditions before releasing ballast and returning to the surface on their own, unmanned and unmonitored for the full duration of each deployment, except for periodic acoustic status checks. My name was Nora Van Tassel, the same Nora from the opening account in this collection, since my career after the Corvid rise took me from towed survey work into autonomous instrument deployment, a shift I made partly, if I'm honest, because I wanted distance from live sonar monitoring after that first night, and ironically ended up designing systems that would eventually put me back in exactly the same position, just once removed by layers of automation. The lander in question, one of 4 identical units our program operated, had been deployed 8 days earlier at a site in the South Atlantic, in roughly 5,100 meters of water, tasked with a multi-week deployment recording current, temperature, and particle flux data on the abyssal plain far from any known feature of geological or biological interest, precisely the kind of featureless, uneventful location our program favored for establishing long-term baseline data, since interesting sites attracted funding for specific hypothesis-driven research. But boring sites were where you actually learned what normal looked like, which turned out to matter more than anyone expected. Our standard operating procedure called for a daily acoustic status check, a brief exchange of low-bandwidth signals confirming the lander's position, depth, and basic system health, conducted from the ship whenever we were on station nearby, or in this case, since we'd moved on to service other landers at different sites across the region, relayed through a moored acoustic transponder network that let us check in on all 4 landers periodically without needing a vessel physically present at each site continuously. On day 8, the scheduled check-in to this particular lander returned nothing. Not an error message, not a garbled signal, simply silence where a response should have been. I want to be clear that lander check-in failures happen occasionally for entirely mundane reasons: a temporary obstruction in the acoustic path, unusually noisy water conditions, a brief power management cycle on the lander's end that delays its response window by a few seconds past our listening window's cutoff. My first response was to schedule a retry rather than treat a single missed check-in as an emergency, since false alarms in this line of work are far more common than genuine equipment failures, and treating every minor anomaly as a crisis burns out both people and budget fast. The retry, sent 11 minutes later, got a response. The lander confirmed its position, essentially unchanged from its last known coordinates, confirmed its depth at 5,097 meters, well within normal variance, and confirmed nominal system health across every subsystem we monitored remotely. The only anomaly in the response was its internal clock timestamp, which showed a time 34 minutes ahead of the ship's synchronized master clock, a discrepancy that, for a precision oceanographic instrument whose entire scientific value depends on accurately time-stamped data, was significant enough that I flagged it immediately as a priority investigation item rather than something to note and move past. I discussed it with our program's technical lead, an engineer named Odalis Kwan Fitzgerald, who by then had shifted from vent field biology into instrument design work for exactly this kind of long-duration autonomous monitoring program, another familiar name recurring in this small professional world. And she walked me through the possible explanations methodically, the way she approached everything. A clock drift of 34 minutes over 8 days was orders of magnitude beyond what the lander's onboard oscillator should be capable of drifting, even under a worst-case component failure scenario. The specification called for drift measured in fractions of a second per day, not tens of minutes across a week and a half. A deliberate clock reset, whether from a software fault or a power interruption severe enough to trigger a full system reboot, was possible, but should have logged an event in the system's fault history, and the retrieved status report showed no such entry. The lander's own internal logs reported a clean, continuous runtime with no interruption whatsoever, directly contradicting the 34-minute discrepancy sitting right there in its own timestamp. Odalys made the decision to trigger an early recovery of the lander rather than waiting out the remaining 6 days of its planned deployment, both to investigate the clock anomaly directly and, she told me candidly, because something about an instrument reporting a clean, uninterrupted log while simultaneously reporting an internal time that made no sense unsettled her enough that she didn't want to wait a week to find out why. We diverted the ship to the lander's site, sent the acoustic release command the following morning, and watched the surface for the lander's ascent, which, unlike the mooring recovery incident that happened to a colleague of mine on a different program entirely, proceeded exactly on schedule, breaking the surface within the predicted window, and recovered aboard without any of the complications that story involved. Once aboard, our technicians began downloading the full data record directly from the instrument's internal storage, rather than relying on the summary status reports we'd been receiving remotely. And it was in that full data set that the actual anomaly finally became visible in detail. The lander's current meter and turbidity sensor, both of which logged continuously throughout the deployment at a fixed sampling interval, showed an 11-minute gap in the data record. Not a system fault, not corrupted data, simply 11 minutes where no readings had been recorded at all, positioned, once Odalys cross-referenced the timestamps carefully against the ship's own logs of the failed and retried status checks, at almost exactly the same window as our missed check-in. Immediately following that 11-minute gap, the data resumed normally, but every subsequent timestamp in the record was offset by 34 minutes relative to what the sampling interval should have produced if counted forward from before the gap, meaning, as best Odalys and I could piece together over several days of careful analysis, that from the instrument's own internal perspective, something closer to 45 minutes had elapsed, during a period the ship's independently synchronized clock only recorded as roughly 11, and the 11 minutes of missing sensor readings sat exactly inside that discrepancy, unaccounted for by any explanation either of us could construct from the engineering side of things. The lander's low-resolution seafloor camera, which activated briefly once every 6 hours to conserve battery across the long deployment, happened to have one scheduled activation fall within that same window, according to its own programmed schedule rather than by any special design on our part. The image it captured, time-stamped inside the anomalous gap, showed the lander's immediate surroundings: flat sediment, its own instrument frame at the edges, with one addition that hadn't appeared in any of the roughly 30 other images the camera had captured across the full 8-day deployment. A faint, out-of-focus pale shape occupying perhaps a third of the frame's left side, close enough to the camera that its lens, focused for the mid-distance seabed view it was designed to capture, couldn't render it with any real clarity, only a soft, blurred mass with no resolvable edge or structure our team could confidently describe beyond its rough position and scale. We recovered all 4 landers from that deployment cycle without further incident, redeployed them at new sites the following season as originally planned, and the 11-minute data gap and the 34-minute clock discrepancy went into our program's official technical report exactly as everything strange in this line of work eventually does: logged carefully, documented precisely, and left formally unresolved, filed under equipment anomaly rather than anything more speculative, because a scientific instrumentation program has no formal category for what Odalys said to me quietly: Once, going over the blurred camera frame together late one night in the ship's small data lab, long after everyone else had gone to bed. That whatever had spent those 11 minutes beside our lander, close enough to fill a third of its camera frame, had apparently been patient enough, and perhaps curious enough, to wait there quietly through an entire deployment cycle, watching an instrument that could not truly see it, for a moment exactly like this one, before finally, once, drifting close enough to be almost, but never quite, caught. I was the fisheries observer aboard a long-line vessel working a permitted deep-set fishery roughly 140 miles offshore, and the strangest thing that ever happened to me at sea had nothing to do with the fish. My name was Ingrid Halvorsen Boatema, the same Ingrid from the Full Ocean Depth submersible account earlier in this collection, since after several more years of trench diving I transitioned into fisheries observer work for a stretch, partly for the steadier schedule and partly, I'll admit, because after that dive at 10,000 meters, I wanted a few years of work that kept me closer to the surface, where at least the water outside the hull was something you could see the color of. Fisheries observers are required aboard many commercial long-line vessels, specifically to independently document catch composition, bycatch, and compliance with fishing regulations, which meant my job was mostly paperwork and patient observation, watching gear come aboard, identifying and measuring every species caught, logging depths and set times, the unglamorous backbone work that keeps deep-sea fisheries data honest. The gear on that vessel ran mainline sets down to around 1,000 meters, targeting deep water species, hooks spaced along miles of line, suspended at depth by a system of weights and floats, soaking for hours before the crew hauled it back aboard. On the haul I remember most clearly, about 2/3 of the way through retrieving a 14-mile set, the line tension on the hauler spiked hard enough that the vessel's skipper, a weathered man named Victor Pell, who'd fished that water for over 30 years, cut the hauler speed immediately and came out on deck himself, which he almost never did during a routine haul. He said, without much preamble, that in 3 decades of longlining he'd felt exactly that kind of resistance twice before, both times right before something came up on the line that he still, by his own account, didn't have a name for. What eventually surfaced, after nearly 20 minutes of careful, slow hauling to avoid parting the line under the unexplained load, was a section of gear where 4 consecutive hooks, spaced roughly 60 feet apart along the main line, had been stripped completely clean, not bitten through, not broken off, but sheared at the leader with an evenness Victor said he'd never seen a fish produce, not even the larger sharks that occasionally took gear that way. Between the 3rd and 4th stripped hooks, the main line itself showed a section of scoring, shallow parallel grooves in the heavy monofilament, 4 lines close together, running for almost a foot along the gear. I photographed and logged all of it exactly as required, filed it in my catch report as an unidentified depredation event, the standard classification for gear loss attributed to something removing catch or damaging equipment without being identified itself. Victor didn't say much else about it that day, but as we finished the haul he told me, in the plain, unbothered way career fishermen tend to deliver their strangest observations, that the 2 other times he'd felt tension like that on a long line, decades apart, he'd never once seen what caused it either, and that he'd stopped expecting to a long time ago. He said the ocean out past the shelf edge didn't owe anyone an explanation, and in 30 years he'd made his peace with that being the whole of the answer he was ever going to get. I worked as the on-call systems engineer for a subsea data center trial, a pilot program testing whether server racks sealed inside a pressure-resistant capsule and sunk to the seafloor could run cooler and more efficiently than any equivalent facility on land. My name was Delphine Achterberg, The same Delphine from the offshore wind survey account and the full ocean depth support operation earlier in this collection, since by that point in my career I'd moved from field survey and dive support into shore-based systems monitoring, a job I'd taken specifically because I wanted, after years of watching sonar screens on other people's dives, to be the one sitting safely on land, while the strange part of the job happened 4 kilometers away from me instead of 6 feet. The capsule sat on the seafloor at just under 900 meters, off the coast of a site I'm not permitted to specify further than that, connected to shore by a single armored cable carrying both power and full data telemetry, monitored continuously from a control room I worked out of in rotating shifts with 2 colleagues. The whole premise of the pilot depended on the capsule being effectively unmanned and self-sufficient for years at a stretch, its internal environment sealed and stable. Its only real point of vulnerability, the external hull sensors that monitored for pressure integrity, biofouling, and any physical contact with the structure from marine life or debris. 11 months into the trial, our external contact sensor, a simple array of pressure-sensitive pads across the capsule's outer hull, designed to register anything physically touching the structure with enough force to warrant investigation, mostly intended to catch fishing gear or drifting debris, snagging on the capsule rather than anything more unusual, logged a contact event at 2:47. In the morning shore time, a single point on the hull registering pressure consistent, per the sensor's calibration, with something roughly 1.5 meters wide, making brief, deliberate contact before releasing. I pulled the capsule's external camera feed, 4 low-light cameras mounted at each corner of the structure, expecting at most a curious grouper or a stray section of derelict fishing net finally coming to rest against the hull after who knows how long adrift. What the camera nearest the contact point showed instead, for a period lasting just under 6 seconds before the feed cut to static and recovered, was a pale, broad surface pressed flush against the outer casing, close enough that the camera's fixed focal length couldn't resolve any detail beyond a featureless expanse filling almost the entire frame, before it withdrew and the water beyond the hull returned to its ordinary empty black. The pressure sensor never triggered again for the remainder of the trial, which ran another 14 months before the pilot program concluded and the capsule was recovered, its data center hardware found in perfect working order, its hull entirely undamaged, the 6 seconds of contact footage filed alongside a maintenance log entry describing an unidentified marine organism investigating the structure, no further characterization possible, no operational impact. The last account in this collection comes from a hydrographic surveyor who asked that we use only her first initial, so I'll call her D. She worked aboard a naval contracted survey vessel doing classified seabed mapping work in a stretch of ocean she wasn't permitted to name specifically, somewhere in the deep Pacific Basin, in water exceeding 6,000 meters. Her account reached us second-hand, through a colleague who'd worked with her on an earlier, unrelated project, and while we can't independently verify every detail the way we have with the other accounts here, the structural details she described match closely enough with everything else in this collection that we felt it belonged as a closing piece. According to that second-hand account, her survey team was running a routine multi-beam mapping line late in a months-long charter, filling in gaps in an otherwise well-charted stretch of seabed, when their deep-towed sonar array began recording a series of long, low-frequency tones almost identical in structure to ones documented earlier in this collection. A sustained frequency, dropping slightly over the better part of a minute, ending in a hard cutoff rather than a fade. She described checking the reference library aboard her own vessel, an entirely separate program from any of the others represented here, and finding the same absence of a match that every other account in this collection independently reported. What made her account worth including, beyond that structural similarity, was a detail none of the others had. Her vessel's array recorded not one tone, but what her team eventually counted as a call and response pattern. A first tone answered roughly 90 seconds later by a second, structurally similar but originating based on triangulation between two separate towed sensors from a position several kilometers away from the first. Two sources, not one animal, not one instrument fault, not one anomaly in isolation, but something that appeared, at least in that single recorded instance, to be communicating across open water at a depth and in an environment where almost nothing about deep ocean life is fully understood even now, after more than a century of oceanographic science. Her team's report, filed through classified channels she was never able to discuss further, even with the colleague who eventually relayed the story to us, apparently reached the same conclusion every other account in this collection has reached, worded in the same careful, hedged institutional language: unidentified, biological or unknown, insufficient data, no further action recommended. That's where this account and this collection ends. Not with an answer, because in 3,000, 4,000, 10,000 meters of water, answers are rarer than almost anyone expects going into this line of work. What you get instead, if you spend long enough listening to the people who actually do this for a living, is a pattern. The same 3 or 4 structural details recurring across a career geologist's core sample: a saturation diver's flooded floodlight, a fire lookout adjacent sonar tech's frozen clock, all of it circling the same unresolved shape without ever quite closing the distance. Whatever is down there in the parts of the ocean that remain, even now less mapped and less understood than the surface of the moon, seems content to stay that way, patient, unhurried, waiting, the way Priya Ilangovan once put it, for something with lights to come and see what's been caught. Thank you for listening tonight. If any of these accounts crossed paths with something you've experienced yourself, or simply want to leave the window open for tomorrow, you know where to find us. Sleep well.